Good morning. Thank you for all being here. I literally last night I said to my husband, I said, given the weather, there's probably going to be 2 or 3 people, which was fine with me. But this is fine too. It's really nice to be here with you this morning. So the title of my talk, as Jim said, is Spiritual Maturity, which it's a little lofty title for someone who's been practicing for only 8 years. But let me assure you that what I'm going to be speaking about comes primarily from 2 really well-respected Zen masters, Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg. So you'll have a little bit more depth than I would be able to provide from 8 years. Although we all have our own wisdom, and I hope that we can share some of that. So the spiritual maturity title presumes a spiritual path, right? I mean, if you're going to have spiritual maturity, you had to be on a path to get to that spiritual maturity. So I will admit that it took me a while from coming here to even understand what a spiritual path was. I was so far removed from even appreciating what that was. I knew I was suffering. I knew I had stress. I knew I wanted that to go away. And I thought, well, maybe meditation might help me with that. But when I attended the primer series at that time, this was like 8 years ago, with Robert, and he used the term in the final class about this is a spiritual path, I was just in my head going, I have no idea what that is. I don't even know what that means. So I'm curious of knowing, do you feel like you're on a spiritual path? And if so, what does that mean to you? And what I'll do is I'll just repeat what people share rather than having to pass the mic around, if that's okay. What does it mean to be on a spiritual path? Anybody have thoughts about that? Yeah, Chris.
I think to me it means like being intentional about your relationship with the universe and thinking about it and thinking about being different this year than you were last year, and being a little bit closer to whatever you call source energy, the universe, God, whatever, being a little bit closer every year, but it's totally, completely individual. Mine's going to be very different than yours and anyone else in this room.
Wow, that is really great. So I'll try to paraphrase a little bit, but what Chris was saying is that for him, a spiritual path is being intentional about your relationship to the universe. That's really nice. And that each year is a little different, and that you are hopefully moving into a progress towards that relationship with the universe, and that it'll be different for every one of us. I might want to steal that as my spiritual path. Does anybody else have any thoughts about what it means to be on a spiritual path? Yes.
I feel like it means to me like making choices based on like how my spirit actually feels versus just making choices based on how things look or other people's stories or some other narrative that doesn't have to do with what's coming from inside of me.
That's really lovely. So making choices from a place of what your spirit actually feels rather than sort of the stories or the reality that you think you are perceiving. Is that okay? Yeah, that's really nice. So it comes from a deep place. And it comes from inside us, not from outside of us. And we talk about here at the Zen Center of coming from the inside out that we come from our inside rather than acting from what is out here, is really coming close to what's internal. One way that I think of it now is that it's a path of seeking, acknowledging, uncovering, connecting to something greater, larger than myself. And I had heard that for years, and I always liked that, but there was something about it that kept me separate. Something greater than myself sounded separate. And that was a piece that really didn't resonate for me. And I was listening to a podcast the other day in which Frank Odaseki was talking. He's a Zen person who opened a Zen hospice in San Francisco. And the person he was talking to was talking about something larger than themselves. And Frank said, yes, it's great. It's something larger than yourself that includes you. And to me, it was like, yes, somebody finally just named it for me. You know, it is something larger than my small self that I live in every day. But it includes me because, in fact, it's my true nature. It's uncovering and connecting with that part of me that is more expansive than the way I tend to live on a daily basis in this small self. Where I am at right now in my life, I've chosen Zen as my guide to this spiritual path. Others might choose Christianity or Judaism or Islam or martial arts or yoga. Any contemplative practice that expands our perception, diminishes our sense of separation, helps us see with fresh eyes. So I think that's one of the things I love about Buddhism and Zen, is it doesn't hold itself out as the way. You know, that there are many ways that can be respected and honored that help us do this connection. One of my spiritual practices is reading spiritual books. And I recently read A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield, a guide through the perils and promises of spiritual life. And I read it with a reading buddy, and we would get together and talk about it. And wow, this is a really comprehensive book on spiritual life. And one of my favorite chapters, although the book is dog-eared and underlined, one of my favorite chapters was a chapter on spiritual maturity. And clearly it's an aspirational chapter. And as you might expect, it comes fairly late in the book, after he's taken you through a lot. And I'd like to share it with you, heavily quoting directly from the book. And I'm also going to refer to this little gem of a book by Sharon Salzberg. I think it's, by my reading of it, it's the first book she wrote in 2003. And it's a little bit of a memoir, but it also is about her thinking on faith, trusting your own deepest experience. And this was recently given to me by a dear friend who has been really essential to my spiritual growth. So I want to refer to this too. So in the Kornfield book, he starts in this chapter about talking about Eastern spirituality in America in the 60s. And he says that it was idealistic and romantic. And people wanting and seeking a perfect guru, the perfect teaching, sort of recipe book instructions for achieving bliss states. Believing that this was the way not only to transform one's personal life, but it was the way to transform the world, is just to find this way to a bliss state. And he says, quote, by undertaking the rituals, the costumes, and the philosophy of spiritual traditions, people try to escape their ordinary lives and become more spiritual beings. So that's interesting to think about, right? Escape, which we know is not what we're trying to do, but we're trying to live within our ordinary life. And Sharon Salzberg speaks in her book of bright faith as sort of this phase. And she distinguishes it from blind faith. She says, with bright faith, we feel exalted as we are lifted out of our normal sense of significance, thrilled as we no longer feel lost and alone. The enthusiasm, energy, and courage we need in order to leave the safe path, to stop aligning ourselves with the familiar or the convenient, arises with bright faith. It enables us to step out, step away, and see what we can make of our lives. And she says that bright faith can resemble blind faith. You know, blind faith being that unthinking devotion to a teacher or a teaching that is mistakenly seen as the fulfillment of the journey rather than the first step. So bright faith is a really wonderful characteristic or quality. It's when we get connected with something starts resonating with us and we get really excited about it. And that's bright faith, that energy. And it's a wonderful quality. It's a first step. It only falls into blind faith when we begin believing that there is a perfect guru, that there is a perfect teaching, that there is the recipe to bliss. It's a heady and mind-body expanding phase, and only time will tell whether one's experience remains bright faith and matures into something more, or whether it falls into blind faith. So going back to the 60s, after a while it became clear to people that being high, bliss-filled, did not last forever, and that spirituality was not about leaving this plane. He says that we discovered that transformation of consciousness required a great deal more practice and discipline than we originally imagined. And we began to see that the spiritual path asked more of us than it appeared to offer. Individually and in communities, through growing wisdom and disillusioning experience, we began to give up the idealistic notion of spiritual life and community as a way to escape the world, from the world to save ourselves. And I wonder if any of this resonates with you here, if any of you came to your spiritual path, whether it started here at the Zen Center or somewhere else, hoping to find relief or release from your life. As I said, a few minutes ago when I was opening, that's certainly what brought me to the Zen Center, was that I wanted relief or release from some of the suffering in my life. And I think at that point, there was actually a belief that there was a way to do that. Intellectually, I didn't trust it, but I wanted it to be true. I so wanted it to be true that if I just tried hard enough on a particular path, that there would be this nirvana that I could sort of stay in all of the time. So the author goes on to say that this work, the spiritual path, requires the end of compartmentalization, an understanding that whatever we seek to push into the shadow or to avoid must eventually be included in our spiritual life, that nothing can be left behind. This kind of spirituality is filled with joy and integrity. It is both ordinary and awakened. The spirituality allows us to rest in the wonder of life. And he goes on to share 10 qualities of spiritual maturity. And I'll share all 10. Some of them I'll spend a little bit more time on than others so that we can move through it fairly quickly. And he starts with quality 1 of spiritual maturity, and it is non-idealism. Mature spirituality is not based on seeking perfection or achieving some imaginary sense of purity. It is based simply on the capacity to open the heart to all that is. It does not seek to perfect ourselves, our bodies, or our personalities. It is not romantic about teachers or enlightenment. He says, in spiritual maturity, there is no judgment and no blame, for we seek not to perfect the world, but to perfect our love for what is on this earth. What a flip, what a reframe. We seek not to perfect the world, but to perfect our love for what is on this earth. That is just profound to me. This acceptance of what is, I don't think it's not a resignation. It's not a resignation. It's a path to seeing more clearly what is and accepting that. And from that place, we can be more skillful. Because if we don't go to the acceptance first, we begin with our projections and our sense of how things should be. And we begin trying to impose and push and place onto the world what we want it to be. But if we can move ourselves to a place of acceptance, even of ourselves, I shouldn't say even of ourselves, but especially of ourselves, we are able to be much more compassionate with the rest of the world. Does anybody have comments on that at all? Non-idealism, that we are okay. The second quality is kindness. Spiritual maturity is based on a fundamental notion of self-acceptance. So in his, what he writes about kindness, he really focuses on kindness to ourselves, which I thought was really interesting, because immediately when I think of kindness, I think of being kind to others. And I went back and read that section on kindness a couple of times because I kept thinking I must be missing it. But he really is focusing in this piece on the notion of self-acceptance rather than guilt, blame, or shame for the ignorant acts we have committed or the fears that still remain with us. In deep self-acceptance grows compassion and understanding. And he says we are asked to touch with mercy the many parts of ourselves that we have denied, cut off, or isolated. To touch with mercy. That is so comforting. That is so nourishing. The author goes on to share the first few stanzas of a poem that will be familiar to many of you. It's Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, which is very apropos, as many of you know. She died last week. And he only includes the first few stanzas, but I'm just going to go ahead and read the whole thing because it's so beautiful. And it's think about it in terms of this spiritual maturity, kindness, self-acceptance. The poem goes, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things." So you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. What I find so amazing about Zen is that this is part of its teaching. Is that I don't have to be good in the traditional sense of the word. I can be kind and generous and compassionate to myself. And in fact, not only can I, but I am encouraged and instructed to be kind and generous and compassionate to myself. Just as I am today, a work in progress, I don't have to wait until I'm perfect to be kind, which is a good thing for most of us. Right? And this is, of course, not a license for unskillful behavior. It's not a license, accepting ourselves as we are is not a license to simply not have an intention to be caring of other people, to be compassionate of other people, to come from a place of caring and compassion. But it just means we don't have to beat ourselves up either. That we are already okay. And that, when we're compassionate with ourselves, I did not realize this when I started this path, but when we're compassionate with ourselves, which means that we allow ourselves to see the parts of us that are a little bit not perfect, right? Where we make mistakes. It allows you to have compassion for other people when they're being not skillful. I'm not sure why that works that way, but I know for myself that as I've learned to become more intimate with myself and see where I have some work to do, it allows me to see, oh, we're all like this. We all have work to do, and it allows me to be more compassionate with other people. So that's the second quality, is kindness. The third quality is patience. And this, of course, is one of the 6 paramitas as well. In this context, Cornfield says, spiritual maturity understands that the process of awakening goes through many seasons and cycles. It asks for our deepest commitment, that we take the one seat in our heart and open to every part of our life. Suzuki Roshi says that the problem with the word patience is that it implies we are waiting for something, right? That we're waiting for something to get better, that we're waiting for something good that will come. A more accurate word, he says, for this quality is constancy. A capacity to be with what is true moment to moment, to discover enlightenment one moment after another. And I really love that. I really love that word constancy. And I think what it means is that in our life, our intention is around maybe not doing the highs and the lows, not reacting in a really incredibly positive way or negative way, but can we greet the world with a constancy and as it is and allow it to come into ourselves. That's very different than patience. Does anybody have a thought about those 2 words? How they speak to you differently?
Well, from what you're saying, the first one can imply a predetermined vision of how you want things to turn out.
Oh.
And then you're just sitting there waiting for that to happen.
That's really interesting. So for the videotaping, Eve is saying that patience in some ways implies that you have an idea of how you want things to work out and you're just waiting for that to happen. So there's a sense of control in it, of expectation. That's really interesting.
Yeah, which is different from the idea of emergence, of just seeing, watching what happens moment to moment. And I'm not saying just passively watching, but, engaging with it and then seeing, what happens out of that. An example is like what's going on with us in the building. I think most of us did have a vision of what we wanted to happen and sort of maybe, and also the way we wanted it to happen. And the ability to sort of step back and let things unfold and take advantage of the opportunities that are offered and not bang your head against the wall for the ones that, aren't, or cursing them.
Yeah, I think that the words you are using are really powerful. That instead of patience, we might think about emergence, allowing things to emerge as they are, and you also use the word unfolding, so that we can be in a place where rather than have an expectation of things how are going to turn out, that we we be present to how they unfold. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, I mean, because it relates the idea of dependent arising.
Dependent arising.
And that, you know, that it's not, I mean, it's Zen Buddhism, but, and larger Buddhist thought, but also systems theory. I mean, they converge there.
So the fourth quality is immediacy. This quality of spiritual maturity speaks to the saying, he says, after the ecstasy, the laundry.
Yeah, well, some of us are better with that than others.
Spiritual maturity recognizes the sacred, the awakening, the enlightenment in the transcendent and in the immediate present. So I think back to the beginning where, you know, in the early bringing of the Eastern thought to the West, that there was this romantic and idealistic idea of sort of the transcendent. That's what they were focused on, is the transcendent. You think that's accurate? I was just going to ask you.
I was actually thinking about the Zen Center in Los Angeles in the early days. We weren't transcending, but we all thought we were bodhisattvas. And we had this idea that bodhisattvas don't get angry. So we were completely dysfunctional. And eventually we had to have, who are the people that did voice dialogue? Hal and Sidra Stone. My teacher, Nicolai McManro, she invited them to come in and help us work it out. And it took, I wasn't there when they came, but I remember being idealistic about being a bodhisattva. And
yeah.
Part of the perception most of us had about that was that bodhisattvas don't get angry.
Don't get angry.
We were really dysfunctional.
So it was a non-acceptance of
kind of idealism about being a bodhisattva.
Yeah. So with this immediacy then, you know, we are not waiting for an experience. We bring our practice into our daily life in a palpable, immediate way. And I guess that's what you needed to sort of do with your anger in some ways, is to...
It's
part of the path. It's absolutely. To recognize it's happening, it's here. Mm-hmm. You bring it all into the path. So, the quality 5 is an integrated and personal sense of the sacred. He says that integrated in that it does not create separate compartments of our life, dividing that which is sacred from that which is not. Sounds pretty similar to what we were just talking about. It's personal in honoring spirituality through our own words and actions. And he says our personal life becomes more genuinely our spiritual practice than any set of experience we have had or philosophy we've espoused. This personal approach to practice honors both the individual and the universal in our life, respecting life as an impermanent dance between birth and death, yet also honoring our particular body, our particular family and community, and the personal history and joys and sorrows that have been given to us. In this way, our personal awakening is a matter that affects all other creatures. You know, when I read that sentence, to me, I hear him talking about the relative and absolute. Honoring both the individual and the universal. You know, that there are both, and that we honor this experience that we're having, that we don't try to get rid of it, that we don't try to ignore this personal experience. And he also was talking about taking this into our lives, this philosophy, this approach, this path into our lives everywhere. And, you know, another tradition or another fellowship that I'm part of is Al-Anon. And some of you may know Al-Anon is a fellowship for people who have been affected by alcoholism in a family member, in a friend, in a coworker, either in the past or now. Or and one of the principles there is that they talk about the principles of the 12-step program is practice these principles in all your affairs. So it's not compartmentalized. And it's not that you just practice those principles in your tough relationships with maybe the individuals in your life who have struggled with substance abuse. You practice them in all your affairs, with your work life, with your friends, because that's how you are bringing your spirituality alive. And to me, that's a little bit of what he's saying here, is that it's integrated and personal. It's integrated. It's not just part of a narrow part of your life. It's part of all of your life. And that's where you're practicing. The sixth quality is questioning, a willingness to discover what is so without imitation and without unquestioningly following the wisdom of others. Our questioning allows us to use the great wisdom of traditions, to learn from teachers and to be part of communities, yet to stay in touch with ourselves, to see the truth and speak the truth with a great respect for our own integrity and our own awakening. In Sharon Salzberg's book, this is sort of the next step in the way she talks about faith, and she calls it verifying faith. The Buddhist instruction to find out what is true for you, to test drive the practice, and to not simply believe what you're told on face value. That's been a really important part of this path for me as well. Sharon talks about the importance of this quality combining don't know mind of Zen with discriminating wisdom. On the one hand, in Zen, we are given enormous autonomy to discover that which is sacred and liberating for ourselves, yet always with the grounding of saving all sentient beings, bringing compassion to our practice, and bringing wisdom to our practice. I was raised in a religion where you just believed, and questioning was frowned upon. And that was really a struggle for me because I have a very curious mind. That's how I operate in the world, is I investigate everything. And so that was tough for me. And this verifying faith, to be encouraged to try it out yourself, to put these practices in place and see how they work for you. It's really, for me, been liberating and allowed me to trust myself much more, allowed me to have some sense of my own path rather than someone giving it to me. The seventh quality is flexibility. Spiritual maturity allows us, like bamboo, to move in the world, to respond to the world with our understanding and with our hearts, and to respect the changing circumstances around us. And the author makes a special point about being flexible about the spiritual path, saying that spiritual maturity understands that spiritual life is not about adopting any one particular philosophy or set of beliefs or teachings. It is an easiness of the heart that understands that all of the spiritual vehicles are rafts to cross the stream to freedom. That's another thing that's really is so wonderful to me, is that we don't have to say that this is the way. It's the way that's most meaningful to me and has been most powerful for me, and so I'm so glad I found it. But others might find other paths, and that's wonderful for them. So we have an easy flexibility. An easiness of the heart is what he says. I love that, 8 is embracing opposites. This quality is about a capacity to hold the contradictions in our heart, contradictions of life in our heart. We no longer seek perfect parents, perfect children, perfectly wise teachers or gurus, trying to find that which is all good as opposed to that which is all bad. We begin to understand that each contains its opposite. Does that resonate with any of you? Yeah. As my mother ages, I'm finding that her body is beginning to break down, and she's been blessed with good health all of her life. She's now going to be 84. And in the last year or two, it's just really been giving her issues. And I listened to her try so hard to find like how to figure it out. You know, like this is something that can be figured out if I just put enough, and that around her eating, this is good, this is bad, and around exercise, this is good, this is bad, and you know, sort of this, just really trying to, if she can just get the right good bad categories, then she's going to be 35 again, or something. I think that's, and I listen to it and I try to help, you know, sort of reflect back that we can't control everything, and but I realize that in my own life I tend to do that too. I mean, I think listening to her, I'm starting to see where it's in me as well, and that my tendency sometimes is to generalize my expectations or my judgments of people, that what they're thinking is, you know, that my boss is all bad. Well, that's not true. That's not true. There are elements of the way that my boss behaves that are frustrating and annoying to me, but there are other elements to the way that my boss behaves that I really respect and admire and think are really great. The same with, you know, my family or my partner. You know, it's just things are not all one way. I think loving kindness practice strengthens my ability and strengthens my appreciation for holding the opposites of people or situations. When I practice loving kindness for someone who is difficult for me, I'm calling forth compassion, and when compassion emerges, I can't help but understand the individual a little bit more complicated than the way I've originally judged them. That they aren't all fill in the blank. They aren't all annoying. They aren't all evil, arrogant, contrarian, self-centered. That's not the whole of their, you know, who they are. So embracing opposites means we work to not solidify our projections wherever they occur. Yeah, Tom.
I was noticing the flowers.
Yeah.
Yellow flowers, and it kind of reminded me of a photograph that I made of dandelion. And I think I felt, for me, the process was successful when I could feel the dandelion as beauty, and also feel and realize the dandelion as weed. And not deny either one. You don't necessarily accept either one in the moment, because it may be valuable to be able to change that mindset as the moment changes.
Yeah. So you're saying that did I hear you just say that the photograph felt right when you could hold both the dandelion as a flower and the dandelion as a weed?
And it took some time afterwards.
And it took.
So it's not just that moment; it's the moments afterwards.
Yeah.
And those beautiful dandelions you have there is just really makes the talk.
Well, you know, I don't know where this comes from, but I know at one point, either during my social work education or during some of my facilitation training that I received, that you were taught to sort of, and you practiced over and over and over, taking second position, third position. So, you know, we sit and we live from first position. This is how I see the world. Taking second position means, can you move into the other individual's point of view, and can you state it? Can you state what they might be perceiving and thinking and how they might see the situation? And then third position is being able to look at the dynamic, the relationship that's going on between these two differing points of view. And by moving around, you get an expanded view of the situation, and oftentimes can help offer something that is helpful to a conflicted situation. So the ninth is relationship. A quality of spiritual maturity is recognizing that we are always in relationship to something or someone, always. And almost that, without that, who are we, or what are we without relationship to something? That we're sort of always in relationship. While we have little control over much of what happens in our life, we can choose how to relate to our experiences. Mature spirituality is an acceptance of life in relationship. With a willingness to relate to all things in life, we enter into a gracious spirit of practice that regards all as sacred. Each act has meaning, and all our encounters are related to the whole of our spiritual life. And he quotes Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, Thich Nhat Hanh is fond of reminding us of how we wash the dishes. Quote, "Can we wash each cup or bowl as if we were bathing a newborn baby Buddha?" So this refers to challenges in life too. The care and compassion with which we relate to the difficulties and problems we encounter is the measure of our practice. So we're always in relationship to something. And can we approach that with some amount of compassion and a sense of the sacredness of it? 10, the 10th and final quality that Jack Kornfield talks about in terms of spiritual maturity is ordinariness. And he says it is the discovery that our salvation lies in the ordinary, which I think is really lovely. There's such a, I will speak only for myself, but I've referenced this already. There is such a desire sometimes, such a grasping for something extraordinary. That's some sort of a goal. And it's so wonderful to be reminded on a regular basis that it is in our daily lives that our awakening, our enlightenment is there for us. So he says our salvation lies in the ordinary. And I love this. He says, when Thoreau warns us to, quote, beware of any activity that requires the purchase of new clothes. He reminds us that simplicity is the way we open to everyday wonder. Isn't that great? That is, talk about down to earth, right? If you feel like you have to have new clothes, maybe you're getting a little too fancy pants. Yeah. And he says, while we can honor the capacity of consciousness to create an infinite variety of forms, ordinariness is interested in what is here and now. The ordinary mystery of breathing or walking, the mystery of trees on our street, or loving someone near us. Some of his sentences just make me literally physically relax. And then finally in Sharon Salzberg's book, she talks about, so we talked about bright faith, we talked about moving to verifying faith, and then she talks about moving to abiding faith. Abiding faith. She says the offering of one's heart happens in stages with shadings of hesitation and bursts of wisdom. Faith evolves from the first intoxicating blush of bright faith to a faith that is verified through our skillful doubting, questioning, and sincere effort to see the truth for ourselves. Bright faith steeps us in a sense of possibility. Verified faith confirms our ability to make that possibility real. Then, as we come to deeply know the underlying truth of who we are and what our lives are about, abiding faith arises. Abiding faith is the bone-deep, lived understanding, one that draws us to realize our ideals, walk our talk, and act in accord with what we know to be true. And then I think she puts this really interesting caveat, a really useful. She said, what distinguishes faith in ourselves from conceit is the fact that conceit lays claim to specialness, while our fundamental nature is not personal, it's universal, it's shared. So that's what I have to share with you on spiritual maturity. If there's any comments or thoughts or questions, we have a little additional time. And if not, we can close. So.
What you said about relationships is something that's kind of been an edge for me. I mean,
Maybe let's do this at this time.
Not sure if I wanted this to be that public, but I have a colleague that I've sometimes said to her that, in our work when we analyze that it's about relationships, that it's not about things, and that's the way I was trained. And sometimes, my colleagues have said they haven't, they don't get what I mean, or that it's too abstract. But I mean, to me it's pretty fundamental, and sometimes it's been hard for me to understand why people don't get what I'm saying when I say that. So because, even ourselves as people or beings, we're the nexus of relationships. We, come out of relationships, between our parents, between ourselves as we grow in the environment. It's, we change. I don't feel like there's this, we tend, I guess, to talk about personality like it's immutable, but I don't think, there's some things maybe that are more constant, but it's in the midst of change, and I don't really experience like myself as a unitary thing, and I don't see anything else that way either.
Thank you for that. Does anybody else have a comment? June.
Thank you for this wonderful talk, Chris. So enjoyed it. One of my favorite qualities is number 3, I guess, patience. I really enjoyed how you said that you can liken it to constancy, because a lot of times I can think of patience as just kind of gritting your teeth and just kind of hanging in there. Which definitely, I think that kind of hanging in and just breathing through a very difficult situation is definitely patience, constancy, and it might be really hard, but I just love this idea of not being with the highs and not being with the lows, and just kind of being here and just breathing and knowing that, whatever is happening is impermanent, and that time can allow you to understand more clearly or not, but that it's not something that you have to be so attached to a certain outcome.
One of my least favorite qualities is patience. When I was younger, my Zumi Roshi used to always tell me, "Joshin, you should be more patient." I would say, "Why? Who needs that?" I've grown to appreciate it with age. It comes in handy. It was a really lovely talk. Thank you.
And can I Your name?
Yeah, my name is Grace.
Grace. Nice to meet you.
Good to see you. I really liked when you were talking about kindness, how the emphasis was on oneself. Because I feel like a lot of times when people feel like they've been compromised, they're like, I was trying to be nice. I was trying to be kind to that person. And how also like being kind can also be like the kinder thing is to not let someone harm you, or not let someone not allow an unkindness to happen in general. And that can be kinder than just allowing things to happen that then later feel problematic. And how if you can kind of be in that like discerning place for what's kind to yourself in the beginning, then you can be kind of more in integrity with the kindness that you share with someone else.
It sounds really spiritually mature. And I think about how you've talked about, you want to unpack that a little bit?
I think what you said is wonderful, and it comes up a lot for all of us, I think, in the practice, and some confusion around compassion being not having boundaries or not standing your ground. And I think part of the maturity of being kind to ourselves and having self-compassion is that we actually are more than willing to draw those boundaries and do it maybe in a way that's skillful, but not. It doesn't mean just letting people walk all over you. And so I think what you brought up is a really wonderful point.
It's also not kind to the other person to let them do that and then have the mess that comes after.
That is very wise, yeah.
I sort of got stuck on the first one, on non-idealism, and I think there's a nuance that I'm trying to unpack. So it reminds me, for me, of all the things that are beautiful about our practice, but also that I struggle with, and the letting things be. It makes me think of the practice of bearing witness, and that sometimes I feel like in the face of brutality, we would be the ones that bear witness. We would be the ones holding the camera phone, the video phone, documenting. And that's not what I'm here to do. That doesn't sit well with me. And so I guess I'm looking for guidance or comment from the community on how to reconcile that not trying to impose your sense of right onto the universe, while also not doing more than just documenting and letting be.
Yeah. I just want to say one thing, and then I'll pass on. The one thing that I think is important is that bearing witness is part of a triptych. There's not knowing, bearing witness, loving action. And so I think what you're talking about is, how do we get to that loving action in a way that's skillful and is not imposing our maybe a narrow point of view? But I think it's a wonderful question.
Really appreciated your talk, and there was so much in it that brought up ideas, and so a combination of some things you said. And June brought up the word attachment. So my clever picture of the dandelion is the picture. It's the picture on the wall. And I think you clarified some of my ideas about it, that the idea isn't to worship that object or feel the object is part of me. It is in sense of the process, but not like I own it. What I got out of it was what happens outside, rather than just inside. And being able to hold those two ideas about the beauty and the weed.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to Chris's comment?
I'd like you to unpack that a little bit more, Chris. Are you saying that you're viewing bearing witness as being passive in the face of something that is unjust, and you are not willing to just document it? You actually need to actively engage in that injustice in some way, advocating for something more just.
Correct.
Is that?
Yeah. And I think I'm sorry. Correct, and I think the passage about non-idealism made me just feel that what was trying to be communicated there was a strength and courage in letting things be. And sometimes I can't do that. I don't want to do that. That doesn't feel right to me.
I think that's a really live question, because I think there is a tendency in our practice of bearing witness to be passive and to be willing to be present to the injustice, but not necessarily actively advocate for a point of view. And that's happening now. There are people actively advocating, and it's necessary for people to fight for what they believe their moral values. And when you see your moral values being compromised, then there's a place and a time to stand up and fight for that. And how you do that is, and I think that's a very live question.
Yeah, and I think I would also say that for me, the way I think about acceptance is, or non-idealism, and I think of acceptance of what is. I think I said this, but I'll sort of state it again. It's that I think when I move into a place of acceptance, I feel like I see more clearly. So if I can accept that this is the reality that's occurring now, and if I do that wholeheartedly and without obstacle, or then I can say that's not acceptable. That's not humane, it's not just. But it's a little clearer, it's not colored with all of my tight reactivity. And I feel like I can respond a little bit more skillfully then.
But you still get to the response.
But you still get to the response.
And serendipitously, the story that I'm going to bring next week is a response to that question.
Great.
And
Oh, good.
So, yeah, that tension between acceptance and action.
It seems like it's important to be moral without being moralistic. And I think that's the line that we often, when we are being advocating, we get righteous about our point of view, and then we start to getting black and white and blaming somebody. But I think I saw Michelle Obama interviewed, I forget who it was, but I was struck by how moral she was, how the strength of her integrity and her values is something I think we're badly in need of now. And I think that's a really important part of a spiritual practice, is that we are moral beings, but and that we be clear about having integrity around our moral values, both as a nation and as a community. But how we, there's a lot of different ways to be skillful about how we advocate those, or I remember being very impressed with Michelle Obama, and I thought we really need people stating strong values at a time when things are so chaotic and all over the place.
Wonderful. Well, it is just about 11 o'clock, so thank you very much for being here, and have a wonderful day.